Going with your family to the mountains or forests brings another kind of joy, a mix of peace and ecstasy. It gives you a way to know each other, work together, even if it's pitching a tent, roasting marshmallows, or just collecting wood for a campfire. You are all together all the time. I always imagined waking up on the Appalachian Mountains with my loved ones around me. Unfortunately, my family has the least interest in it, except for Oscar, my cousin. Since school, we were together, and in that picnic, we were together on our so-called survival skills. He was my age, 15, and we both loved adventure. We were always up for trying new things, whether it was climbing the tallest tree we could find or daring each other to cross a cold mountain stream barefoot. This time, our challenge was to venture deeper into the woods than we ever had before. With a flashlight, pistol, and pocket knife each, we left our camp and the warmth of the campfire behind to explore the area, eager to prove our bravery. The campsite fire burned behind us, growing smaller and smaller until its glow disappeared. Eventually, we were left with our flashlights, only to guide us further into a dark forest, stretching in every direction. The woods seemed like an all-owned home to all animals and beings living there, with their sounds echoing out loud, making us silent yet focused. At night, those sounds gave a shriek of fear, especially when you're in the dark with one source of light. That's why Oscar and I were holding each other's hand, trying to stay together. With every step, the forest seemed like a danger zone, feeling like we were putting ourselves at risk. At one point, the air seemed cooler, and the trees seemed to close in around us. "Let's see who's better at spotting tracks," Oscar whispered, trying to keep the mood light. It was a silly challenge, one of many we'd made up over the years, but it helped distract us from the uneasy feeling that had been creeping in ever since we left the campfire. As we looked around the forest floor, our lights caught a glimpse of broken twigs, patches of disturbed soil, and small animal tracks. We crouched behind a large tree, comparing what we'd found. Oscar pointed out a line of prints that looked like they belonged to a deer. I countered with a scuffed patch of dirt I claimed was made by a fox. Then, out of nowhere, a sudden noise broke the quiet, a branch snapping. We froze. My heart thudded in my chest as I strained to hear anything else. Oscar's flashlight wavered slightly, its beam darting nervously through the trees. For a moment, we didn't move, didn't speak. It was as if the forest itself had stopped breathing. My flashlight swept the trees ahead. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then I saw a massive shape moving slowly beyond where our light reached. "Did you see that?" I hissed, gripping Oscar's arm. He didn't answer right away. His flashlight quivered, and I could tell he saw it too. The animal moved closer, its silhouette barely outlined by the faint glow from the distant campfire. It was enormous, its fur catching the faintest traces of light. Then, as it turned its head toward us, I saw its eyes a fiery amber color that seemed to pierce through the darkness, steady and unblinking. "That's not a bear," Oscar whispered, his voice tight with fear. "It's a tiger," I said, barely able to get the words out. A tiger. My thoughts raced in all directions. Tigers weren't supposed to be here, not in the Appalachian Mountains. Yet there it was, moving with a fluid power, its enormous frame gliding through the underbrush. Everything about it radiated control. My instincts screamed at me to run, but something deeper held me in place, warning that even the slightest movement could spell disaster. Oscar and I froze like statues, scarcely daring to breathe. The tiger's steps were deliberate, each one a display of confidence. It carried itself with an eerie calm, sussas shifting smoothly under its fur. I wondered if it could hear the pounding of my heartbeat, which felt as loud as the forest itself. Time seemed to stretch as the tiger moved into sight, its eyes scanning the trees, and its ears twitching slightly at every sound. My legs felt rooted to the ground, my hands clammy around the flashlight and knife. Then, without warning, the tiger turned and slipped back into the shadows, its movement as silent as a passing cloud. For a few moments, Neither of us moved. The weight of what we'd just seen kept us pinned in place. But as soon as the last trace of its presence disappeared, Oscar and I bolted. We ran as fast as we could, crashing through the brush and skidding to a stop only when we reached the comforting circle of the campfire's light. My dad was crouched near the fire, poking at the wood. He looked up as we stumbled in, panting and wide-eyed. "What happened to you two?" he asked, frowning. "We saw something," I managed to say between gasps. Oscar nodded, still trying to catch his breath. "Saw what?" Dad pressed, setting his stick down and giving us his full attention. "A tiger," I blurted out. Dad's eyebrows shot up. "A tiger? Here?" He shook his head, clearly not believing me. "You probably saw a big bobcat. They can look pretty intimidating in the dark." "No," I insisted. "It was huge. It had these glowing eyes, and it wasn't a bobcat." Dad sighed, shrugging off my words with a wave of his hand. But early the next morning, as we packed up our campsite, he paused. There, just a few feet from the tent, were paw prints, massive ones, too big to belong to any bobcat. He didn't say anything, but the look on his face said it all. "What's got you two so worked up?" he asked. "We saw a tiger." I blurted out. "Right there, just past the firelight." Dad chuckled, shaking his head. "You boys are too flimsy and oblivious. It was probably just a big bobcat. They're common around here." "No, it wasn't a bobcat," I insisted. "It was way bigger. Its eyes." But he wasn't having it. All right. Let's all settle down. It's getting late anyway. Get some rest." Frustrated, but too exhausted to argue, we dawdled to our tents. Sleep didn't come easy, though. Every rustle outside made me jump. My mind replayed the tiger's glowing eyes over and over. I wasn't sure if I'd even closed my eyes when the first rays of sunlight began filtering through the fabric of the tent. The next morning, Dad was the first to step outside. We followed, still groggy but alert. I'll never forget the way his face changed when he saw the enormous paw prints in the dirt just a few feet from our tent. He crouched down, measuring one of them with his hand. "Okay," he said slowly. "Maybe it wasn't a bobcat." By the time we packed up camp and headed back to the nearest ranger station, the news had already broken. A tiger had escaped from a wildlife sanctuary miles away. Search teams were combing the woods, urging all campers to leave the area. Officials were confident the tiger wouldn't venture far, but the idea that it had wandered so close to us was both terrifying and thrilling. For days afterward, the story dominated local headlines. Oscar and I couldn't stop talking about it. Dad, to his credit, admitted he'd been wrong and even cracked a joke about never doubting his tiger-spotting sons again. But for me, the experience left a deeper impression. The forest, for that moment, became a terrifying place for me and Oscar. That incident made me realize how unpredictable the natural world could be. It wasn't just about the tiger, it was about the realization that no matter how much we thought we knew, there were always surprises lurking out there, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves and show who is stronger. After that encounter, things changed for us. Although Oscar and I are still adventurous souls, our approach is not the same now. Gone were the days of venturing deep into the woods on our own. Instead, we go on group trips. We go with them to remote areas to guarantee our safety and learn from others' experiences so that after around 5 years, maybe, we can go ourselves to find peace, solitude, and joy. The thrill of adventure didn't fade, but it was now tempered with caution and respect for the unexpected. Even now, years later, I sometimes think back to that night. I can still see the tiger's glowing eyes and the way it moved so silently through the woods. It's a story I'll tell for the rest of my life, not just because it's unbelievable, but because it taught me the importance of preparedness and the value of shared experiences. The wild remains unpredictable, but with the right precautions, it's a place where we can continue to explore together and a little more wisely. Cranberry Wilderness. It's the name stuck in our minds since our teens. Jacob, Teddy, Amelia, Ruby, and I grew up together. We lived in the same neighborhood, went to the same school, and now in the same college. After exams, we did one thing, convinced our parents and planned a weekend camping trip to the Cranberry Wilderness. We were sure that the journey there was an adventure in itself. Staying at Amelia's home the whole night, the next day on Saturday early morning, we all set off for the adventure in Jacob's car, grooving and singing to music. Amelia had created the playlist, a mix of classics and high-energy anthems that perfectly matched our mood. Every beat seemed to heighten our excitement, and even getting stuck twice due to confusing forest roads didn't dampen our spirits. Kudos to Teddy's navigation skills and maps. They saved our day, and we reached earlier by 11 a.m. When we finally arrived, we did nothing for an hour. We just sat outside, looking at the scenery, realizing how the forest stretched endlessly with sunlight bursting through the trees and floor, brightening them and casting golden patches on the ground. The air felt fresh, and we all felt awake. We stood in awe for a few moments, inhaling the beauty before unloading our gear. Later, we walked a little farther, finding the perfect spot to set up camp eventually, settling on a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. It felt secluded and peaceful, exactly what we'd hoped for. Once there, we pitched our large tent, laughing as Teddy struggled with one of the poles while Ruby tried to read the instructions upside down. By the time we finished, the tent stood tall, and it was time to relax. Amelia pulled out a badminton set she'd packed, and we spent the next hour playing under the dappled sunlight. Every hit and miss had a story. Amelia was the worst player, and Ruby was the best, but Jacob took credit, proclaiming himself the undefeated champion. Afterward, we settled onto picnic blankets, sharing snacks and watching the way the sunlight faded as the sky became dark. By evening, we had the campfire. Its warmth was much needed at night, and it became a source of bringing us together around it. While gossiping, we roasted marshmallows, passing them around while sharing exaggerated stories about bears and mountain adventures. The jokes came easily, and our laughter echoed through the woods. When the fire dimmed, we zipped ourselves into the tent, ready to call it a night. The others fell asleep quickly, but I lay there, staring at the fabric ceiling, surrounded by the faint sounds of the forest. At first, the noise of crickets and occasional hoots of owls seemed charming, like a soundtrack to our adventure. But as the minutes stretched on, the chirps felt sharper, as if the birds were screaming, and the rustling outside the tent became more deliberate. My imagination went wild. Was that a branch snapping? A creature prowling? To be honest, it was obvious to happen because the forest is not as romantic as you've imagined. My heart raced with every sound, and I knew I couldn't lie there in growing fear. Quietly, I reached for my backpack and fished out my phone and a bag of chips. If I couldn't sleep, I might as well distract myself. I opened Netflix, and the series was there to keep me busy, with chips and biscuits as my midnight feast. When I realized Ruby had stashed a couple of beers in the cooler, I cracked one open. The screen's glow lit up the tent, and soon enough, I was lost in the story, laughing softly to myself. If I couldn't conquer the night, I could at least make it mine. Somewhere past midnight, when I was at the climax of my series, Amelia's voice made me lose focus. I stopped the chip I was taking inside as I heard her voice. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "Still in my scene," I mumbled. "What?" "It sounded like laughing," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Jacob stirred. "It's probably just your imagination. Go back to sleep." However, I got back to my scene, but then I heard the laughter too, felt like somebody laughing far away. It was a frightening laughter after all. We are Joker movie generation. Laughter is no longer a heart-warming emotion for us. That laughter was shrill, dissonant, and unsettling. At first, I shrugged it off, thinking it could have been an animal, maybe even the wind playing tricks on me. But Teddy stirred beside me, his breathing changing. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his tone hushed but alert. The sound came again, closer this time, and an unfamiliar tension crept into the tent. I could not distract myself anymore. My mind was trying to make sense of it, but my body started pouring a sense of unease. My skin crawled at the back of my neck, and my heart thudded harder. Teddy sat up slightly, his silhouette rigid against the faint moonlight. Instinct told me to peek outside, to confirm it was nothing. But reason held me in place. The forest wasn't the place for impulsive people. And secondly, going out at that moment is equal to putting myself at risk. That's why I stayed inside, gripping a chip like it could somehow shield me. My gaze flicked to the screen in front of me, a silly sitcom now feeling oddly detached from my reality. I crunched another chip, my way of silencing the growing worry, and with a deep breath, let the laughter of the show pull me back. Ruby sat up, her eyes wide. "That's not one of us, is it?" We all exchanged nervous looks, suddenly wide awake. The laughter grew louder, cutting through the silence like a warning. Then came the sound of footsteps, as if somebody was coming near us. My heart jumped to my mouth as we sat frozen, barely daring to breathe. Jacob grabbed the flashlight, but none of us had the courage to go out. Then, without warning, something pressed against the fabric of the tent. A finger, or at least, it felt like one traced a slow, deliberate circle near where Amelia was sitting. She stifled a scream as the rest of us pressed ourselves back against the far side of the tent. The laughter, now right outside, turned into a manic noise that echoed in the darkness. Before we could even process what was happening, the tent began to shake violently. The figure outside pulled and twisted at the fabric, as if trying to tear it apart, all while laughing in a way that seemed to cut through us. "Who's there?" Jacob shouted, his voice cracking as he held the flashlight tightly, its beam casting frantic movements around the tent. There was no response, only the sound of the shaking and the laughter that sent waves of panic through us. I clutched Ruby's hand, feeling her trembling as badly as I was. Then, as abruptly as it had started, everything stopped. The laughter faded, and the footsteps went back, the noise fading to none, leaving us in stunned silence. No one moved for what felt like an eternity. Even the usual night sounds of the forest felt vanished, as if the world itself was holding its breath. "What was that?" Teddy finally whispered, breaking the silence. No one answered. What could we say? We sat huddled together for the rest of the night, jumping at every tiny sound. I did not know when we slept, but the next day, we woke up to birds chirping, especially when Amelia's phone started vibrating under my pillow, giving me unease. I woke up first, sitting up, yawning and stretching. The daylight and flying birds felt like a balm on frayed nerves. The tension from the night before hadn't disappeared entirely, but the soft warmth of the sun brought an undeniable sense of relief. Slowly, we emerged from the tent, stretching stiff limbs and exchanging tentative smiles. Breakfast helped us adjust. Jacob and Amelia worked together on omelets, their quiet chatter punctuated by the sizzle of eggs in the pan. Teddy brewed coffee while Ruby toasted bread and reheated marshmallows, insisting on using the last few skewers from last night. We ate in a comfortable silence, savoring the simple joy of food and sunlight, as if daring the forest to challenge us again. Afterward, we wandered toward a nearby lake. We stayed there for a while, throwing stones and creating ripples. It actually made the time worth spending. Meanwhile, Amelia and Ruby took pictures. For a brief moment, it was easy to forget the unease of the night before. By noon, as the sun was striking at us, Amelia broke the spell. "We should think about packing up," she said, her voice calm but firm. "The morning's been great, but another night out here, it's just not worth the risk." None of us argued. The memory of that high-pitched laughter and the way something pressed against the tent was too fresh. By mid-afternoon, we'd packed everything and started the hike back. It felt lighter this time, as though the forest was letting us go without a fight. The drive home was filled with a different kind of conversation. We talked about what went wrong and how to make sure it didn't happen again. We agreed that camping in remote spots was not a good choice, as we were amateurs. From then on, we stuck to official campgrounds where other campers go too, Surprisingly, this shift helped us meet experienced hikers and campers. They welcomed us into their circle, sharing tips, stories, and even inviting us to join them on trips. Over time, what had started as a fearful adjustment turned into a doorway to a richer outdoor experience. That night in the wilderness taught us caution, but it also showed us the value of community. The forest still held its mysteries, but now we ventured into it with knowledge, preparation, and friends who understood its challenges as well as its beauty. Maya and I were always camping lovers. We loved to leave the city behind and be ourselves in nature. Usually, we went with groups, but that time, back in 2017, we chose a remote part of Tennessee, a spot we'd stumbled upon during our endless research of the state's hidden gems. It was a perfect spot, a secluded clearing with trees all around. We pitched our tent, set up a small fire, and spent the day hiking through the woods, sharing stories and basking in the sun. By nightfall, we were both exhausted but content, ready to drift off under the star-speckled sky. Sometime around 2 a.m., I woke up, unsure of what had disturbed my sleep. The tent was filled with the cool, damp air of the forest, and the woods outside seemed wrapped in an eerie stillness. Only the faint rustling sound reached my ears, coming from just beyond the thin fabric of the tent. At first, my groggy mind dismissed it as an animal, a raccoon, or maybe a fox scavenging through the remnants of our camp. I was on the verge of turning over and surrendering to sleep again when the sound shifted. The rustling grew louder, more deliberate. It wasn't the random shuffling of an animal. This was different footsteps, slow and measured, crushing dry leaves with unmistakable intent. The sound sent a chill up my spine, and I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it, but the deliberate rhythm of those steps made my chest tighten. For a moment, I debated waking Liam, unsure if I was overreacting. But the sound grew nearer, its pattern steady and unmistakable. My pulse quickened. Someone or something was outside the tent, moving toward us. The once comforting silence of the woods now felt oppressive, thick with an unspoken threat. My chest tightened. "Maya," I whispered, nudging her. She grumbled something incoherent and shifted in her sleeping bag. "Maya, wake up," I urged, my voice a little louder this time. She finally stirred, her eyes barely open. "What is it?" she mumbled. "Listen," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the sound of my pounding heart. Liam and I lay there in absolute stillness, straining to catch even the faintest sound. For a moment, the world outside the tent seemed to hold its breath. The footsteps had stopped. I started to second-guess myself, wondering if my imagination had conjured the sound, fueled by the darkness and the eerie quiet of the woods. Then it happened. A shadow moved across the thin fabric of the tent, slow and deliberate. My stomach dropped, and my heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. I barely dared to breathe, as my eyes locked on the faint outline of the figure. It wasn't a fleeting movement caused by wind or an animal. It was unmistakably human. My mind raced, grappling with the reality of the situation. Why was someone out here in the middle of the night, creeping so close to our tent? My chest tightened, with a mix of fear and disbelief. Liam shifted slightly beside me, his breathing shallow, and I could feel his tension matching mine. Whoever was out there, they were far too close for comfort. "What the hell?" Maya muttered, sitting up. She was wide awake now, her expression mirroring my own fear. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced with what-if situations, each scene one more terrifying than the last. I had so many questions in my mind. Why was someone here, in the middle of nowhere, creeping toward our tent? I swallowed hard and called out sharply, "Who's there?" The shadow froze. For a moment, everything was silent except for the sound of my own breathing. Then, the figure retreated, moving quickly away from the tent. Through the mesh window, I saw him clearly for the first time, a middle-aged man, dressed in dark clothes, disappearing into the woods. Seconds later, we heard the crunch of footsteps fade into the distance, followed by the unmistakable sound of a car door slamming. A vehicle started, its engine echoing through the trees, and then it sped off down the gravel road. Maya and I sat frozen in the tent, the silence around us feeling heavier than the darkness itself. My hands trembled uncontrollably, and my pulse pounded loudly in my ears, drowning out even the faintest sounds of the night. I struggled to steady my breathing, each shallow inhale a reminder of the fear gripping me. "Did that just happen?" I whispered, my voice shaky and barely audible. Maya nodded slowly, her wide eyes reflecting the same disbelief and fear I felt. The tent seemed both a fragile barrier and a cage, offering little comfort against the unknown that had just unfolded. "Yeah," Maya said, her tone flat but her eyes wide with unease. "We need to get out of here." We grabbed our flashlights and scrambled out of the tent. The night was pitch black, the moonlight barely penetrating the canopy of trees. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified. We didn't bother packing up our gear. We just grabbed the essentials and bolted for the car. Once inside, we locked the doors and sat there, breathing heavily, trying to process what had just happened. "Who do you think he was?" Maya asked, breaking the silence. I shook my head. No idea. But he wasn't just passing through. He was creeping toward us. "That's not normal." Maya nodded, her jaw tight. "Yeah, that was messed up." We stayed in the car for the rest of the night, the engine idling in case we needed to make a quick escape. Sleep was out of the question. Every so often, one of us would scan the area with a flashlight, but there was no sign of the man. Still, the unease lingered, like an invisible weight pressing down on us. Yet, we did not know when we slept, when our minds were alert. Probably, the brain got tired, started shutting down, and that's when we dozed off without knowing. The next day, we woke up to the alarm sound. After stretching and looking at the bright sky, I woke up Maya, and together we cautiously stepped out of the car. After all, we couldn't forget what happened yesterday. The campsite looked the same as we'd left it, but we were no longer in the mood to stay in the forest. We packed up our things in silence, both of us eager to leave. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd narrowly avoided something terrible. Who was that man? What were his intentions? And why had he chosen our campsite? The questions gnawed at me, but I knew we'd never get answers. Maya broke the silence as we merged onto the highway. "You think we should report it?" I considered it. "Yeah, even if nothing comes of it, it's better than doing nothing." We stopped at a ranger station a few miles down the road, intending to report what had happened. The ranger behind the desk listened carefully, jotting down notes as we described the shadow, the footsteps, and the car speeding away. But his expression remained impassive, almost routine. "You're not the first to report something like this," he said finally, his tone grim but detached. "There've been a few incidents in this area lately. We'll look into it." Maya exchanged a glance with me, her lips pressed into a thin line. As we stepped outside, she shook her head. "It's just like last time," she said quietly. "Remember Aaron's story? He reported a similar thing, and nothing came of it. It's not worth the effort." I wanted to argue, but she had a point. The authorities hadn't acted before, and chances were slim they would this time. Deflated, we got back in the car and drove home. The events of the night replayed endlessly in my mind. The shadow creeping toward us, the deliberate crunch of footsteps, and the sound of the car disappearing into the night. For weeks, the memory lingered like a stubborn bruise, making me question whether I'd ever feel safe camping again. For 2 months, we stayed away from the woods, the thought of another encounter enough to keep us tethered to the safety of the city. But the pull of the forest proved too strong. After all, once you're used to it, you get addicted. And we are highly addicted to forests. That's why, after the second month, when a few friends suggested a group camping trip, we decided to give it another shot. Camping with a small group brought a sense of security we hadn't felt in a while. Sitting around a fire, sharing stories, and listening to the hum of the forest reminded us why we loved it so much. The fear didn't vanish entirely. It lingered in the quiet moments, in the rustle of leaves or the crack of a twig, but it no longer controlled us. Even now, we're more cautious. We choose busier trails, camp in larger groups, and always keep an eye on our surroundings. But we've learned that fear doesn't have to rob us of the things we love. The forest is still our refuge, our addiction, and no shadow will ever take that away from us. Granny's cabin in North Carolina gave us memories, especially to me and Archie, my cousin. When we were 13, our summers used to revolve around the woods behind her cabin. We'd spend countless afternoons there, climbing trees, skipping stones across the creek, and making up wild stories about hidden treasure or forgotten caves. It was our dreamy and imaginative home, a place where we could be kids without anyone telling us to be quiet or come home early. One afternoon in late July, we decided to venture deeper into the woods than ever before. As we started going, we found trees big enough to stop sunlight from reaching down to the ground. We crossed the creek, using a fallen log as our bridge, and laughed as we stumbled on slippery moss. "Bet no one from school's ever been this far," Archie said, puffing his chest out like an explorer. "Yeah, probably because they're smart enough to avoid getting lost," I shot back, though I felt the same rush of excitement he did. We kept moving, our sneakers crunching on twigs and leaves. The woods were quieter than usual, almost unnaturally so, as if animals avoided staying there. The birdsong we'd heard earlier had stopped, and even the sound of the creek faded as we went further in. "Freddie," Archie said suddenly, stopping in his tracks. "What?" I asked, looking up from the stick I'd been swinging at low-hanging branches. "Do you hear that?" At first, I thought he was messing with me, but then I heard it, a rustling sound, coming from the other side of the creek. "Probably a raccoon or something," I said, shrugging off the sound because you couldn't expect something romantic in the deep forest. I was more focused on either covering distance or going camping. Yet, as we stepped further ahead, the rustling grew louder. Archie and I stepped closer to the edge of the creek, peering through the dense brush. My heart was pounding in my chest, and the excitement from earlier had turned into something else entirely. Then, it stepped into view. It was an enormous creature, with a body covered in thick, dark hair that looked tangled and rough. Its arms were long, hanging almost to its knees, and its legs seemed too strong for something. That size. But what made me stand still were its eyes. They seemed to glow, locking onto us, with an intensity that made me forget to breathe. Its face wasn't quite human, but it wasn't fully animal either. The features were distorted, almost like someone had taken the worst parts of both and fused them together. It paused for a moment, as if sizing us up, then turned and walked away into the trees, its heavy steps echoing even after it disappeared. "Run!" Archie shouted, snapping me out of my daze. We bolted, tearing through the woods as fast as our legs would carry us. Branches scraped our arms, and roots threatened to trip us, but we didn't stop. By the time we reached the familiar edge of the woods, we were gasping for air and covered in scratches. "What was that?" Archie asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I reply, still struggling to catch my breath. We ran all the way home and told our parents, our neighbors, anyone who would listen. Most people brushed it off as a prank or a product of overactive imaginations. A few nodded along, humoring us, but clearly not believing a word. But Archie and I knew what we'd seen. For weeks, we avoided the woods entirely. The thought of going back was too much. Eventually, though, curiosity got the better of us. We returned, staying close to the creek this time, but we never ventured as far as we had that day, and we never saw the creature again. Years have passed since then. Archie and I are grown now, with jobs and lives that keep us busier than we'd like. But whenever we meet up, that day always comes up. We've tried to explain it away, telling ourselves it could have been a bear or someone in a costume. But deep down, we know better. It wasn't just the size of it, or the way it moved. It was the way it looked at us, like it understood us, like it wanted us to understand something too. I've read about similar sightings over the years, stories from other people who've seen creatures they can't explain. I've even gone back to the woods a few times, hoping to find some clue or sign that it was real. Archie's less keen on returning, but he still believes me, just as I believe him. We don't talk about it with others much anymore. People are quick to dismiss things they don't understand, and honestly, I don't blame them. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't believe it either. But I did see it, and so did Archie. What haunts me isn't the memory of the creature itself, but the feeling that it was more than just a strange animal in the woods. It felt like we'd stumbled into something we weren't supposed to see, something that belonged to a world just out of reach of our understanding. The woods still call to me, though. I visit every now and then, not as often as I used to, but enough to keep the connection alive. Archie and I even started camping again after a couple of months' break, though we always go in a group now. There's something about the forest, the mystery, the beauty that keeps pulling us back. We friends, me, my friend Craig, and two others gathered at a gaming zone, and out of nowhere, decided to go camping for 2 days. The decision was made, and we just landed at my home as I had all the supplies. In an hour, all the bags were packed, and we were off for the trail. After around 2 hours, we reached the main wilderness, as it was super close to my home. For a while, we sat there idle, and then got ourselves busy, setting up our tents in the late afternoon, sharing jokes and swapping stories. The moment seemed perfect, as we were away from the city and were ourselves there. Beer, good food, and good company, all was there. We needed nothing after that. Yet, by 11 p.m., the campfire had faded, and we each retreated to our tents. The day's hike had left me exhausted, and it didn't take long for me to fall into a deep sleep. Then, around 3 a.m., I woke abruptly. My chest was tight, my breathing shallow. It wasn't the kind of wakefulness that comes from a bad dream. It felt different, primal, as if some unseen force had flipped a switch in my brain, screaming danger. I lay still, gripping the sleeping bag around me, trying to make sense of the sensation. The woods outside were unnervingly quiet, with not even the usual sounds of insects or the occasional rustle of branches. My father's words echoed in my mind. When the woods go silent, something's wrong. My hand instinctively reached for my Beretta 92S. I kept it loaded but safely tucked away when camping, more for peace of mind than any real expectation of needing it. At that moment, though, it was my lifeline. With the safety off and my pulse hammering in my ears, I scanned the interior of the tent. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling of dread wouldn't leave me. Finally, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The moonlight was bright enough to reveal our small clearing surrounded by endless trees. My tent was slightly elevated on a small slope, giving me a good view of the open field below. That's when I saw a massive lizard. It was around 6 or 7 feet long, with a long, sinuous body and legs that moved in a way that was disturbingly precise. It stood still, its body blending unnaturally with the shadows around it. I couldn't tear my eyes away. I was legit staring at it, feeling how the hair on my hands and neck stood up in fear and shock. Then that lizard-like creature raised its head, its attention fixed on something in the trees, maybe trying to sneak up on small animals. Then, as if the animal's will simply broke, it froze mid-step and collapsed, motionless. The creature didn't hesitate. It moved swiftly, closing the distance in a way that sent a chill down my spine. It snatched the animal, its claws wrapping around it effortlessly, and began retreating into the woods. Even from a distance, I could hear its breathing heavy and deliberate. Every crunch of leaves and snap of branches was like a countdown until it disappeared into the forest, taking the strange silence with it. My heart felt like it might give out. My body screamed at me to do something, anything, but I was frozen. Finally, I found the strength to crawl out of my tent and make my way to Craig's. "Craig," I whispered, shaking him through the tent wall. To my relief, he unzipped his tent almost immediately. His face was pale, his expression telling me everything I needed to know. "You saw it too," I said. He nodded, his voice barely audible. "It was watching something. Then it just took it." We sat there in his tent, too terrified to speak much, our ears straining for any sound of the creature's return. I couldn't shake the image of it, its deliberate movements, its unrelenting focus. It wasn't just the size of the thing. It was the way it seemed to command the space around it, as though nothing in the woods dared challenge it. We all sat together, holding each other's hands. Fear engulfed us, making it challenging to even spend an hour there, inside. That's when one of us thought about Netflix. We got ourselves distracted there, and it legit helped us find ease in our skin. By the time the sky started getting lighter, we looked up through the tent, then looked at each other, deciding through eye contact the urgency to leave. As we drove away, Craig finally broke the silence. "What the hell was that thing?" I didn't have an answer. None of us did. For months afterward, the memory haunted me. Every detail of that night stayed vivid in my mind. I found myself reading up on strange animal sightings, cryptids, and local folklore, hoping to find some explanation. But nothing matched what we'd seen. Craig and I didn't camp again for a couple of months. Later, we started again, but with groups and only at safe places because we couldn't see any other stupid thing anymore.